These questions come from the Math No Calculator section of the PSAT 8 and 9 practice test. For number one strategy with fractions is that we can cross multiply to have two equivalent statements, and we can get 4x is equal to 180, divide, and find our answer. Another idea is to try to figure out how did I get from 4 to 60? Well, I had to multiply by 15. And if I apply that same idea to 3, I get right to my answer, 45. This is a proportion problem. So we have a table of values with x's and y's, and if we figure out the pattern, here on the left the x's are increasing by 1, and here on the right the y's are increasing by 2, that tells me that my slope is going to be 2. So if I look at the slopes for each one of these, well, only one of them has a 2 and I'm done. So this is a systems of equations that you have to interpret from a story problem. If you track the variables, they tell you that the x value, which is tickets, sell for $90 each, and the y values, also tickets, for $250. So I know I'm going to plug in 90x plus 250y, and for the total I'm going to use $27,600. For my other equation, I know that the airline sold 120 tickets. I don't know how many of each type, but I know that if you added together the total tickets, I would get 120. And then we look and see, well, that shows up right there. So number 4, this is a quadratic expression, and all of my answers are written in factored form. So I could use something like the quadratic formula, and I would eventually get the right answer, but the best approach is probably just to factor these. And factoring is a riddle. You're trying to figure out two numbers that meet a series of conditions. For example, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply together to give me negative 60, and two numbers that add up together to give me negative 17. Now normally I would start with this value of negative 60 and I'd try to come up with some different factors. A list might include things like 20 times 3, 15 times 4, 12 times 5, 10 times 6, etc. But I can just look at my multiple choice options and figure out that I'm either using 12 times 5 or 20 times 3. I know that my product has to be a negative number, so I could use negative 20 and a positive 3, or I could use a positive 20 and a negative 3. Same thing with 12 and 5. One of them has to be negative. So those are my 4 different options, according to my choices over here. And how can I add these numbers together to get negative 17? Well, it turns out the only one that works is right here, negative 20 plus 3. And that means that D is the answer, because that negative 20 comes in over here, and that positive 3 right there. Another way to approach number 4, if you had no idea about any of this factoring stuff, if you put this into your calculator and y equals and press graph, this 3 and negative 20 represent the intercepts. This is called an intercept form. So x plus 3 means what can you plug in for x that will make your y value 0? And it turns out that's over here, negative 3. And what can you plug in for x to make your y value 0 here? That's 20. So if you just look where your parabola crosses the x-axis, that's another way to find your answer. So for number 5, this is a slope-intercept problem. If I just pick a couple points on this graph and I figure out my rise over run, you might notice that I go down 3 and then right 1. That means that my slope is going to be negative 3. So 3, negative 3, 1/3, or negative 1/3. Well, it's this one. No extra work required. For number 6, I have to distribute this negative 2, or at least the 2, but I'm going to distribute the negative with it. And that means this becomes plus 2x and minus 10y. I combine like terms, and my final answer is negative 9x plus 21y. So number 7, there's a lot of words there, but pretty much this is my formula, and I want to find out what represents h in terms of all the other variables. So I start off with p is equal to something, and at the end I want h is equal to something. So everything that's not an h here, I'm going to move to the other side. So I'm going to subtract s from both sides, and this gives me p minus s is equal to dgh. And then I'm going to divide both sides by dg. And I'm left with p minus s divided by dg. So in number 8, this formula comes from maintenance plus fuel per mile, and then plus the insurance. So the slope is maintenance and fuel put together per mile. We should know that for a year is a one-time cost. We can rule out A and B. It has to be something per mile. For number 9, I'm going to combine like terms, and this gives me negative 10x. And then I'm going to combine like terms again, and this gives me negative 2. And I set this equal to 0. I could add 2 to both sides. Negative 10x is equal to 2. I can divide by negative 10. And if I simplify this fraction, or if I put it in decimal form, I'm going to get negative 0.2. For number 10, the first thing I have to do is know the volume formula for a sphere, which I think comes at the front of the typical test for the PSAT, but I didn't include it, sorry. And the part that's relevant here is the r cubed in particular. Then I know that the small ball bearing, compared to the large ball bearing, I have to double the radius. So whatever the radius was cubed becomes 2 times whatever the radius was cubed. Well, there's this property of exponents that says if you take something like r cubed and you multiply it by 2 cubed, you'll get 2r cubed. And the difference between these two is just whatever 2 is cubed. 2 times 2 times 2 is equal to 8. For number 11, to find the y-intercept, or where a line crosses the y-axis, we're just going to plug in a 0 wherever we see an x. So these parts will all cancel out, and we're left with 3. Number 12 is a system of equations problem. I could use substitution or elimination. And I know that I want to cancel out the y's and just get an answer for x. So I notice this y in the top equation is all by itself. I could scoot over the 3x to the other side, and that would tell me what y is equal to. And I could use this as a replacement in this other equation. I could rewrite this as 2x minus 4 times the quantity, negative 3x plus 13, is equal to 18. If I distribute the negative 4, I get this. And if I combine like terms and solve, x is equal to 5. Of course, I could have also solved this using elimination. I would multiply the top equation by 4 so that my y's line up, and that way when I add straight down, they cancel out. And I also get that 14x is equal to 70, which if I divide both sides by 14 gives me the exact same answer, that x is equal to 5. For number 13, we have shoes, that's one of the costs, and we have 12 people times $3 a pair. We're going to spend 36 total on shoes. I could just take 212 and subtract 36 right now. That means I spent $176 on the actual per game cost. If I want to figure out how many games were played, 4 people played 2 games, 8 people played 3 games, multiply them, add them together, 32 total games were played. And you might be thinking, that's simple, 176 divided by 32. But remember, this is the no calculator portion, so if you didn't know how to do that in your head, you might use repeated division instead. For example, if I cut each of these in half, I get 88 over 16. If I do the same thing again, I get 44 over 32, or excuse me, over 8. And if I go from there and I take 22 over 4, well, 20 divided by 4 is equal to 5. That's part of it. And then I have 2 divided by 4 left over. That's 0.5. My answer is $5.50.